Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of St. Louis's lunchtime event. My name is Gina Perry. I am a board member of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis and happy to be helping with emceeing this event. For those of you who aren't familiar with the World Affairs Council, our mission is to connect St. Louis to the world and the world to St. Louis. And we've been around since 1948. Seth has put a link to the website in the chat box if you want to check it out later for more information. We work with the State Department frequently on programs such as the International Visitor Leadership Program, where we bring in foreign leaders to introduce their respective counterparts on various topics such as entrepreneurship, non-governmental organization management, agriculture, law enforcement, and many more. We also bring foreign dignitaries, such as the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the U.S., Princess Rima bint Bandar Al Saud. And Seth will also put a link in the chat so you can learn more about our mission and how to become a member and how to become involved in the World Affairs Council of St. Louis. First, I'd like to introduce Irina Karmanova. She works in the U.S. Department of State Office's public liaison, and she's our liaison for this event. And so I'll pass it over to you, Irina.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a real honor. My name is Irina Karmanova. I work in the Office of Public Liaison, and our mission is to connect the American public with some of our foreign policy experts on conversations such as this one. We work a lot with World Affairs Councils, Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, high schools, universities, diaspora organizations, you name it. And we discuss these hot button topics that are of interest to you all. And hopefully we can stay connected as we go forward. So thank you again for your attention. And I'll have Seth George play a quick 1 minute long video on the State Department to kick us off.
Confronting our adversaries, in protecting our citizens. We advance democracy, human rights, global health, and more. We grow markets that create American jobs. We are America's first federal agency, and we're in 190 countries. At over 270 U.S. embassies and consulates serving you. We are the United States Department of State.
All right, thank you, Irina. Before we jump into our speaker, just one quick housekeeping item. If you have questions, we'll do a question and answer session at the end, but please place that question in the Q&A box that's located down on the lower part of the Zoom panel. This way we can make sure that we see it and that we're able to answer it. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, you can just go ahead and put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them towards the end. So we have a really exciting conversation today about the conflict between current global energy needs and the road to zero by 2050. And it's my pleasure to introduce Daniel Rockbird. He works for the State Department's Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, supporting the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change's work on International Climate Corporation, with a particular focus on the Global Methane Pledge. He rejoined the department in November of 2021 after several years at Emory University, where he taught climate policy and was the founding director of the Georgia Climate Project. Before that, he spent 17 years with the State Department, during which he served as special assistant to the lead U.S. climate negotiators under Presidents Bush and Obama, helped shape the president's Global Climate Change Initiative and the U.S.-India Partnership to Advance Clean Energy, and he co-founded the State Department's Greening Diplomacy Initiative. Daniel was a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and received the State Department's Superior Emeritus Honor Awards and Emory University's Sustainability Innovator Award. He holds a BA in Human Biology with honors in Environmental Science, Technology, Policy, and a master's in Earth Systems, both from Stanford University. So I can't imagine a better person to speak on this topic. Daniel, I will hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Gina. And I'm looking forward to interacting with all of you. I'm sorry I can't see you all right now, but so please do make active use of the Q&A box or the chat. If I am not monitoring it actively as I'm talking on, maybe Gina and company, please do feel free to just interject and weigh in if there's something that comes up that's timely. I'm more than happy to stop midstream and address anything, and then certainly to take questions at the end. So very excited to be here, really grateful for the opportunity, grateful to Irina for her team's work to connect the State Department to friends and partners all over the country, and also Gina to what you all are doing at World Affairs Council to connect St. Louis to the world. So an important part of my bio, which I realized I omitted, is that I am from St. Louis. I was born and raised in University City. I went to University City High School, and I'll come to that in a second. Let me pull up my slides. Gina, please shout if this is not showing. Otherwise, I will assume that it is, and give me 1 second to see if I can.
We can see your heat is on slide, so I think
fantastic. Good. And hopefully I'll try to pull up the chat as well so I can see that. So give me 1 second just to get that as well. So if something does come in, I can see it. Great. All right, good. That is the topic. The heat is on, and Gina, you and your colleagues mentioned the conflict between global energy needs and the road to zero by 2050. So I definitely want to address that. I'm going to do that by taking it a step even further back and talking about climate change in general, talking about why it is a defining issue for foreign policy, for national security, and what we are doing about it. And I will say then, as I mentioned at the outset, let's see if I get this to work. Born and raised in St. Louis, I grew up in University City, right near the Lions statues. For those of you who know St. Louis and U City, I went to U City High School. And so I realized this weekend when I was thinking about this talk, how excited I was, because I love to talk about climate change, but I also really love St. Louis and the Cardinals. So I imagine some of you here will share at least one of those passions in the Cardinals. I also imagine some of you might not follow the Cardinals as closely or might be relatively new to St. Louis. So I apologize in advance, and I'll do my best to explain my references here, but I will throughout make a bunch of references to the Cardinals as I try to talk about climate change. And that's why the talk is titled The Heat is On. So for those of you who are fans of a certain age and were Cardinals fans in the 1980s, this was a theme song, I think, in the 1985 pennant race. It's a song by Glenn Frey, which I can still hear in my head every time I see this picture. But it's quite pertinent for our talk today. So I will talk about three things. Number one is going to be why climate change is a defining issue for US foreign policy and for national security. Number two, what we need to do about it. And number three, some examples of key policies. And there are so many things underway right now. It's very exciting. There's also so much more that needs to be done. I will only scratch the surface of some of these policies, undoubtedly leaving many more questions and answers, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of a few examples. So I'm going to start with the first, which is why is climate change a defining issue for US foreign policy and for national security? Some of you might have seen this. This very pretty picture is actually telling a very sobering story. Each of the vertical stripes here is a year of temperature data. So 1850 is on the far left and 2018 is on the far right. And the colors relate to whether that year was on average colder than average or warmer than average. And as you look from left to right, you see a lot of colder and a lot of in the middle. And then when you get to the far right, you see a very dramatic and very concerning trend. The last count I saw was that 21 of the 22 warmest years on record have been since the year 2000. We haven't finished tabulating the record data, the temperature data for 2022, which is why this year is not on that list. The only other one outside of since 2000 was 1998. So there's an incredibly rapid warming trend on the planet. We are now in Celsius, about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than we used to be. 1.1 degrees Celsius sounds like a very small number, but it's actually massive in terms of what it means for us. And that's what I want to talk about, why this is a defining issue. So the reason that a seemingly small temperature increase in average temperatures matters is, first of all, that's an average. So that means that in the summers, you're having extreme warm temperatures and heat events. It also means that you're having a change in weather and temperature patterns geographically. So it's actually a lot warmer in the Arctic than it is at the equator during some of those spells, which leads to things like melting ice. And so the way I think about this as a sort of policy person informed by science rather than a scientist doing policy is 3 W's. The world is warmer, that is making things weirder, and in turn, warmer and weirder are making things worse. The warmer bits speak for themselves. As the planet warms, we deal with more extreme heat events, and you get expansion of the ocean, and you get melting ice, and you get sea level rise, which is quite significant and concerning in and of itself in terms of the impacts it's driving. Weirder means that the climate system changes as the system gets warmer, and that leads to changes in precipitation patterns. Paradoxically, you get more and less rain, so you'll get more extreme downpours and flooding events, and you'll also have more extreme drought events. And you also see an increasing frequency and intensity of a variety of extreme weather events. So those two together, which have their own impacts together, of course, lead to a cascade of other impacts, which is the third W, is the worse. Basically, it is impacting already, climate change is impacting lives, livelihoods, and the natural systems on which all of those depend. So our ecosystems, water, food security, health, infrastructure, economic development, and national security. And I want to speak a little bit to the national security piece right now. The US government's National Intelligence Council and the director of the National Intelligence came out with an unclassified assessment in 2021 of what climate change means for US national security. The central takeaways pop up here, basically that climate change is going to be exacerbating risks to US national security, both because of the physical impacts of climate change and what that means for populations around the world and stability, as well as for the geopolitics and the tensions around how we are or are not responding collectively to this challenge and the US role in that effort. This chart provides a bit more detail, but you'll see they have 3 different categories of risk that they're quite concerned about. One is, again, the tensions over how we're responding to climate change. The second is geopolitical flashpoints that might come up because of a changing climate. And the third is what's happening to country level stability. And you'll see just a few things flagged. As an example, they assess very high impacts, especially by out to 2030 and 40, for cross-border migration attributed to climate impacts. So you can imagine if there is food insecurity or drought or extreme weather in one part of the world and you are living there, you might be forced to or motivated to move to somewhere else, leading to cross-border migration and climate refugees. Strain on energy and food systems. So one of the questions I was asked for this conversation was the sort of tension between global energy security and our climate change work. So that's something that's at play here. And certainly greater demand for aid and humanitarian relief. So this is a kind of a big through line through some of our efforts on climate adaptation, as well as our efforts to secure increasing federal funding for international assistance for climate change, very much the ounce of prevention, pound of cure dynamic going on here. There will be year after year, more and more demands for aid and humanitarian relief to deal with climate impacts. And that should force us all to think very carefully about how much we're investing on the front end to prevent and build resilience to those impacts. And then in the actual document of the US National Security Strategy that was released a few months ago, climate change features very prominently for all of these reasons. So this document, the National Security Strategy, says climate change is the greatest potentially existential threat for or problem for all nations, and then actually unpacks this issue of temperatures that I mentioned at the outset, which is without immediate action during this crucial decade, and the president and John Kerry have called this the decisive decade, global temperatures are going to cross this threshold of 1.5 degrees. So all of those stripes I showed you brought us up to 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than the average. Every 1/10 of a degree, even though a 1/10 of a degree sounds like a very small amount, is billions, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of additional economic damages and all the associated risks to lives and livelihoods and natural systems. So there's a real concern that if we don't take dramatic and unprecedented action this decade, we will not be able to keep this 1.5 degree threshold within reach. And then we, amongst other things, are worrying about increasingly about irreversible climate impacts that will either not be stoppable or will play out over centuries with no ability to stop them. Here too, in the National Security Strategy, there's explicit reference to the nexus between climate change and energy, including recent events in Russia and Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and the ability, as stated here, to weaponize energy for other purposes in a geopolitical context. So that is why the US government thinks climate change is a defining issue for US foreign policy, for national security. Happy to take questions on this topic going forward if you have thoughts or any questions or concerns. What I want to move to now, though, is what do we do about it if this is such a big issue? And here I'm going to dig into Cardinals references, so apologies for the rest because I'll be spending a lot of time on St. Louis baseball as well. So if you think about the way the Cardinals have won over the years, it's basically two keys to success. To reduce it to its very simple form, we have at times incredible offense, at times incredible defense, at times we have both. This issue of two fundamental approaches to solving a problem, in this case offense and defense, there's an analogous equivalent for climate change, which is there are two main solution spaces for climate change. It's kind of offense and defense. In this case, the offense is keeping temperatures from warming a lot more, and the defense is building resilience to the impacts that are already underway. And so to play this out a little bit with some charts and graphs, this is a chart, I forgot to put the citation. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of thousands of scientists working with literally every government in the world to summarize the state of climate science periodically. And this is from their most recent report that came out in the past 12 months. The y-axis here, the vertical axis, is degrees warming, where you see a dashed line at about 1.1 already. That's where we are. And what they were trying to figure out is if you look at, in this case, unique and threatened systems, as the world goes to where we are now and even warmer, how risky is that? What are the impacts and how do they change as the world warms? And they, it's very hard to put a precise number on these things, but they said, listen, down here, it's close to the moderate risk and impact. We are already right now between moderate and high in terms of the level of risk and impact we're facing for unique and threatened systems. Think coral reefs as one example. And then as we get into the purples, we're in very high. And obviously the warmer you get, you stay in very high, but it gets worse and worse and worse. So it is in our collective interest to keep warming as close to where it currently is as possible, and to avoid going up to nearly 3 or 4 degrees, which is where we were on track to go about a decade ago. So they looked at unique and threatened systems. They looked at extreme weather events. They had a slightly different gradation, but the same idea. We're already at moderate risk. As we get to 1.5, we're at high risk. And we get to 2 degrees, we're at very high risk. They looked at how these impacts will be distributed across countries. They looked at global impacts, and they looked at large-scale singular events, each of them having different gradations of causes for concern and reasons for concern. But the bottom line for all of them is as you get warmer, it gets a lot worse. It gets a lot riskier. The impacts are stronger. Again, we're talking about orders of magnitude, like trillions of dollars as we get warmer. So back to offense and defense, the two ways that we think about it, two kind of North Stars for our effort. Number one is we have decided to really focus on a 1.5 degree threshold and mitigate against warming above that threshold. So to try to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach to forestall or prevent these even more catastrophic impacts of a changing climate that would come as the world gets warmer. So that's one of the solution spaces. It's called mitigation, climate mitigation. The second one, of course, is we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. We're already here. And even if we are successful, even when we are successful at limiting warming, this stuff is already happening, already baked into the system. We can't avoid it. We have to figure out what to do with it. We have to adapt to these impacts. We have to build resilience to those impacts. So those are really the two solution spaces for climate change. When you think about a global response and a national response, and even at the level of the greater St. Louis area or an organization, those are the two things one has to do. You have to do everything you can to reduce emissions, to mitigate against worse impacts, and do everything you can to respond to the impacts that are already here and that are unavoidable. So these are, again, the two solutions. Number one, keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. And to unpack that a bit more, like how do we keep 1.5 C within reach? What do we control, and what is the mechanism through which the world is warming? Many of you probably know this, so I won't belabor it, but here, the Earth's atmosphere, this incredibly thin skin around the planet, this atmosphere has always had a bunch of gases that do a decent job of kind of warming the Earth like a blanket. In effect, what we're doing is adding more blankets into the atmosphere by adding more greenhouse gas molecules, which trap more heat and warm up the Earth. So it's the emissions of those gases that are the main lever that we can think about to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach, both reducing the emissions that are going up, as well as using natural sinks like forests to absorb gases. And one of the main ways to think about that, this is data, it's a little bit dated, but the overall schematic really still holds today, even if the data has advanced several years. This on the vertical axis here is global emissions, and this is tracking from 1990 to about 2010 or 2012, measured in this case in billions of tons of greenhouse gases, of carbon dioxide equivalent. So an upward trajectory. The pathway that's coming up on the screen now is where we were headed, we thought, under business as usual around 2011, which is emissions going from roughly 50 billion tons to north of 150 billion tons potentially by the end of the century, which would leave us in a world of warming of potentially 4.1 to 4.8 degrees Celsius. So remember that chart I showed you, we're at 1.1, the impacts get worse and worse and worse as you go to 1.5 and 2.0 and 2.5. And this was a future in which we might be at 4 or 4.8 degrees of warming. By the time this chart was developed, this data was put together. Oh, no, skipping ahead. This is the path that we would need to be on with our emissions. This is how much we would need to bend our global emissions curve to keep warming to 2 degrees or below. And this is the curve, or the range of estimates, that our emissions would need to be on to keep temperatures at the 1.5 degree threshold. And this science has advanced a little bit. The latest from the UN actually has this curve crossing the x-axis mid-century. So we're talking about net zero emissions for the entire planet by the middle of the century. So again, we were going here, we need to go here. This is the name of the game. When we talk about keeping 1.5 degrees within reach, and every one of us makes commitments and pledges and hopefully follows through on them, the ultimate litmus test is, does the cumulative impact of that work mean that our emissions are going from where they were going, very high, to where they need to go, net zero by mid-century? And does that put us on the path we need to be on then to keep temperatures from increasing? This is very daunting, of course. Some good news in the category of maybe glass quarter full, not half full, is that come 2015, the pathways that were actually on the books had us in a little bit better position. And then the Paris Agreement and the pledges therein, which I'll talk about in a bit, in 2015, they seem to, if implemented, which is a gigantic if, put the world on a trajectory for closer to 2.5, 2.6 degrees warming, which again, if you remember that chart, means a lot of very, very dangerous impacts, but it is better than where we were before. So again, one of the main things we need to do about climate change is get this curve down to here as quickly as possible to keep 1.5 within reach. The other piece of the puzzle, as I mentioned, is adaptation, building resilience to climate impacts. And here, there's just an incredible case to be made, as I mentioned up front, for paying upfront to avoid costs down the road. So this is an estimate from the Global Commission on Adaptation of the benefit cost ratio of investments in things like early warning systems, resilient infrastructure, climate resilient agriculture, mangroves, et cetera. You see anything from a 9-to-1 down to a 4-to-1-ish ratio. In other words, $1 spent saves you 10, makes you 10 in terms of net benefit over time. So a huge rationale from an accounting perspective for investing now in preparedness, in resilience and adaptation to avoid steeper price tags down the road. Here's an example of adaptation in action, which one of my colleagues who works on this most closely is very excited about, and rightly so. This is a series of cyclones in Bangladesh, 1970, 1991, 2007, 2019. Cyclone Fani was similar in magnitude, as I understand it, actually to Bola in 1970, but came after any number of incredible efforts to build resilience to this kind of disaster, so that while in 1970, this cyclone resulted in 300,000 deaths, the 2019 cyclone resulted in 5 deaths. You see up here, this includes early warning systems, cyclone shelters, civic awareness, buildings, post-disaster recovery, et cetera. Another example from one of my colleagues is this road in the Philippines, which was something that was supported by a US government agency called the Millennium Challenge Corporation. It was a $200+ million road building project. But in the design of this road, the engineers involved recognized that this part of the Philippines was subject to risk from extreme weather events, especially storms. And so they recommended a relatively modest, I think it was 10% of the overall cost, set of engineering investments in things that would make this road more resilient because of water drainage and runoff. A few years after this road was completed, Typhoon Haiyan came through the Philippines. It was incredibly devastating. this road survived and served as a major artery for recovery following the typhoon. And so I think the counterfactual is impossible to know, but I think it's worth considering what would have happened if this road too had washed out and what that would have meant. Okay. So I've just covered the first and the second. I only have the third left, which is some examples, but let me just see. I see some questions in the chat. I just want to peek at them really quickly. James Kaiser, AI to solve the climate crisis. Interesting, and we should talk about that. Developed nations kept their climate control promises. Also an excellent question. We should talk about that. Okay, both great questions. I'm going to come to those at the end if that's okay, but happy to talk about those and others that come up. Okay, so the last thing I want to finish with is examples of key policies. And here I'm going to dip back into my love for St. Louis baseball and try to come up with an analogy for key elements of the puzzle. So first is the architecture. So Busch Stadium is a wonderful place to watch baseball. It took several years to get to the current Busch Stadium through several evolutions. We had Sportsman's Park, Busch Stadium, I guess, which became Busch Stadium 1, then the second Busch Stadium, the first one that I went to a game in. My first memory of Cardinals baseball is the Cardinals winning the 1982 World Series, and then the current stadium. Just as the architecture for baseball is vitally important to shaping how the team plays, where they play, letting them play, there is an architecture for the international climate system as well, which is in the form really of the Paris Agreement. That architecture has also taken an incredibly long amount of time to build, and it is also incredibly important to sort of set the context for everything we do. So I want to spend a few minutes explaining the history of the Paris Agreement and what it means for our approach. And what I'll do, this is a picture of one of the meetings. We just had one in Sharm el-Sheikh. This is the 2007 equivalent in Bali, which is the 13th Conference of the Parties, COP13. And what I'm going to show you is just a preview or a summary of headlines from the New York Times after these meetings. And you'll see this has been going on for a while. And if you just read the headlines, it's a little perplexing what's happening. So 1988, the first headline I found on a 35-nation country on global, 35-nation conference on global warming. In 1990, a headline about taking steps toward a global climate pact. 1992, a headline about the signing of a climate treaty. On to 1995 with some more efforts. 1997, a new accord on greenhouse gases. 1998, a deadline to form rules, more discussions in 2000, more discussions in 2001, more discussions in 2001 still, 2002, on and on and on, 2004, 2007, 2009, 2010, 12, and then this headline from 2015 with this landmark climate deal, which is the Paris Climate Accord. So I want to talk a little bit about what was going on through this series of headlines. And of course, these meetings have continued. We just had one a few weeks ago. This is not a scientific chart. It's more of an impressionistic chart of how I view this history. There have been a series over the course of those headlines of peaks and valleys in the level of effort and attention provided to climate change on the international scene. I would argue that those peaks and valleys have been successively higher over time. And the peaks themselves are landmark moments in this process. And I'll unpack them in a second, but you see they start in the 1990s, go on to now, and they cross administrations. Bush, Clinton, Bush again, Obama, Trump, Biden. And happy to talk later about various policies across administrations, but they really have obviously, ebbed and flowed throughout this cycle. The key agreements to know about, basically the foundational agreement was the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. Maybe you think about that a little bit as Busch Stadium 1, or Busch Stadium 2 rather, the one that was the AstroTurf Stadium. That really was the basis for a lot of what we do now. The Kyoto Protocol was a protocol to this treaty. Copenhagen Accord and Cancun agreements, one of the things we were doing through this time was extending our time horizon. So Kyoto Protocol set goals out through 2012. Here we set goals out to 2020. Here we set goals out to 2025 and then set up a process for goals out to 2030 and 2035 and beyond. And we just came out of another set of meetings in Glasgow last year and Sharm el-Sheikh this year. What I really want to highlight here is what the Paris Agreement then, this piece of the puzzle, brings to the table and how it's structured, because it really is now, I think, the stadium that we're all playing in for climate policy going forward. This is exact language drawn from, these are excerpts from the Paris Agreement. One of the key provisions here is the indoctrination of, or the enshrinement of, a global temperature goal. So a goal of holding the increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5. So this idea of keeping 1.5 within reach that I talked about. A second key element of the Paris Agreement was this requirement that parties, which are countries who are part of the agreement, communicate what is called a nationally determined contribution, or NDC, which is in effect a pledge from a country to take certain steps to reduce their emissions, as well as on adaptation at times and other aspects of climate policy. And then they should do this every 5 years. And the third piece that's related to the second is this requirement that every successive NDC, or nationally determined contribution, should represent a progression beyond the current NDC. In other words, this idea of a ratchet mechanism where every 5 years, countries not only submit a pledge, but are asked to submit a pledge that is more ambitious than their current or previous pledge. And the idea is that over time, from Paris out to 2020, 2025, 2030, and on, as we get to mid-century, countries are re-upping their pledges. They are holding each other accountable with respect to their follow-through on the pledges, which is one of the questions here from Linda. And that in the process, there's this ratchet mechanism that is increasing ambition sufficiently to rise to meet the scale of the challenge, the bending of the curve that I spoke about earlier. That's the theory of the case for the Paris Agreement and the structure. It is a compromise in that it is a hybrid of a kind of top-down approach, which was the prior approach under the Kyoto Protocol that I referred to briefly, where countries are assigned a target and a timetable and they go back home and they have to implement it, versus a more bottom-up approach, which is embodied in the 2010 Copenhagen and Cancun agreements. And here it's a bit of a hybrid of the two. It's got some top-down elements and some bottom-up elements. Okay, so that's one example of a key policy of the Paris Agreement. That's the stadium, the architecture, the background where we're playing. I'll give you a few others, and again, I'm going to give short shrift to any number of really important and impactful policies because we only have a certain amount of time today. But I want to talk about Stan Musial, and this is delicate territory because he is rightly revered in St. Louis and across the baseball community, and I don't think any one policy embodies who he is. But bear with me here, which is one of the things that Stan Musial did. Well, the thing he did was he was an incredibly sustained, long-lasting example of world-class Hall of Fame caliber performance and character. These are his stats. It's in painfully small font, but what I want to highlight, I can do verbally, which is he played for the Cardinals his entire career that spanned 22 years, including plus a year out when he was in the military. During that time, he was consistently amazing. He led the league in batting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. He, over the course of his career, accumulated incredible progress, over 3,600 hits, over 400 home runs, a career batting average of 331. Okay, so what might be the Stan Musial of climate policy? I would argue that the NDC, and in this case, I'm going to talk about the US nationally determined contribution, can be, should be, needs to be the Stan Musial of US climate policy, a long-running, always improving, consistently high-performing embodiment of commitment to excellence. Here's where we are now, which is this is what our nationally determined contribution has looked like. This is historical US emissions. So this is like the chart I showed you earlier, but it's just the US. So instead of being 50 billion tons for the planet, we're talking about between 5 and 6 billion tons for US greenhouse gas emissions. It's from 1990 to 2017 when this chart was first produced. And the first nationally determined contribution we submitted under Paris was this one, to go 26 to 28% below our 2005 level, which is right here, and to do so by 2025. So this orange dashed curve. And then in Glasgow last year, we had one of those bumps on the graphic I showed you where we are trying to ratchet, and the whole world is trying to ratchet. Countries are submitting new NDCs. So the next NDC the US submitted was 50 to 52% below 2005 levels in 2030. Now, of course, this is a nationally determined contribution. This is what we aspire to do, what we've told the world we are working towards. It does not guarantee results. And so the real test of the US NDC and any other country's NDC is whether or not not only how ambitious is the goal, but how successful is the country on achieving their goal. So I'll come to that shortly. Okay. I wish I could see faces and figure out whether this is immediately resonates with you all or not. But my third example is from a particular moment. Hopefully some of you, when you see this picture, know exactly what I'm talking about. But if not, I'll bear with me and I'll explain a little bit. This is the analogy here is a clutch hit that a lot of people desperately wanted to happen, and that a lot of people thought was never going to happen and was virtually impossible. And when it did happen, it was incredible, and yet it's still not enough. That's the analogy here. So Albert Pujols faced Brad Lidge in the, actually I don't remember the year, 2005 or 2006 National League Championship Series. At this point, the Astros had never been to the World Series, or if they had, maybe it was many decades ago, but I believe never. And they were literally one strike away from winning their fourth game of the series. This was game 5, I believe. They were up 3 games to 1. With one strike from Brad Lidge, one of the game's dominant closers, they would win the game, they would win the NLCS, and they would be on to the World Series for the first time, I think, ever. If I'm looking at this right, I believe that's actually former President Bush and First Lady Bush in the stands watching the game, waiting for this moment. So I was in Baltimore at this time, randomly, and watching this game and doing what baseball fans do, which is I was staring at David Eckstein and I was thinking, oh God, here we are, 2 strikes, 2 outs, we're down by 2 runs, nobody's on base. Okay, what if David Eckstein manages to get on base? Then we have 2 outs, 1 runner on, we're still down by 2. Okay, next batter, Jim Edmonds, I believe. What if he gets on base? Oh my gosh, if he gets on base, then we have 2 people on, we're down by 2 runs, and we have Albert Pujols, who's one of the game's best hitters at the plate. And what if he hit a home run? Then we'd win the game, which is like, I think, a thought process that fans go through in any close game, especially a high stakes game, and 999 times out of 1,000, our hopes are dashed because they're just that, they're our wild hopes. But in this case, David Eckstein got on base with a 2-strike count. Jim Edmonds drew a walk. Albert Pujols came up and hit a very bad slider from Brad Lidge, basically to the moon, which led to this picture. So it was amazing. It was absolutely incredible. I think we'll remember it forever. And so it's a clutch hit, right? It's a clutch hit that no one expected would happen and had this huge impact. So then the question is, what's this a metaphor for? I hope, well, curious your thoughts on this. Earlier this year, in August of 2022, the US Senate passed the Inflation Reduction Act. This is something that was introduced by the president in March of 2021 in a wildly different form, as a bill that would do a lot of things, including be an unprecedented commitment and contribution by the United States to reducing its own emissions. It then went through any number of near-death experiences over the course of the ensuing 15 to 18 months. And then, much to a lot of people's surprise, in August of 2022, it resuscitated, revived, and became, was passed by the Senate and signed by the president. This bill is a package of investments in the US clean energy economy and other aspects of US climate policy that are incredible for the US economy, incredible for growing clean energy industry in the US and supporting other activities. This is a bunch of clean energy tax credits, clean fuel tax credits, carbon capture and sequestration, residential credits, innovation, environmental justice, climate justice. There is investment here in agriculture and forestry. And the impact of it, there we go, is about 1 billion tons of reductions in US government emissions by 2030. This is one group's modeling of the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act as passed, showing that it would take US emissions, which are on this downward trajectory, and put us in the neighborhood 31 to 44% below 2005 levels by 2030. And remember, the goal, the NDC, is a 50 to 52% reduction. That's not all the way there, but it's a massive, massive, massive contribution towards that end, and something that allowed the president to go to the meeting in Egypt and speak very publicly and very optimistically about the US's chances of achieving the 50% reduction now on the strength of the investments, in large part on the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act, and a number of other policies. So very much a clutch hit for the planet, for US leadership on the international scene. The counterfactual here is really difficult to imagine. Had the US gone to the latest series of climate talks, having not put its policies where its mouth is, having not walked the talk the way that we did with the Inflation Reduction Act, the geopolitical dynamic around climate change would have been a lot different, and it would be for a long time. Now we're in a much different and very credible, I think, position of walking our talk in a way that's really, really important. That said, the coda to this story is US St. Louis won this game 5-4, staving off an Astros victory. We went on to lose the next game. The Astros did make it to the World Series. That's a bit of a downer to end on, but it's important to keep in mind, which is, though the Inflation Reduction Act is an incredible clutch hit for climate policy and incredible progress towards keeping a 1.5 degrees Celsius future within reach, it is only a piece of the puzzle. We need many, many more wins of that magnitude coming from many more countries to be on track, especially the biggest emitters. Think about China, think about India, think about the European Union, et cetera. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, 15 minutes left, so I'm gonna race through these last bits and then get to Q&A. Next example, Vince Coleman was, as those of you who followed baseball at this time, a very long time ago, incredibly fast, stole 50 bases in a row without being caught once. And the reason I bring him up is not all climate solutions are long-term. Some of them are very important precisely because they're near-term. And I want to talk about methane in this context. Reducing methane emissions, which is one of the greenhouse gases that goes into that atmospheric skin that I showed you, is actually one of, if not the fastest ways to keep 1.5 within reach. And it's just a function of how methane works in the atmosphere. If you look at contributions to our, this is another graph that shows warming to date. So here's 1.1-ish degrees, and this is the net human influence. This is how humans are warming the planet. Turns out a big chunk of this 1.1 degrees comes from methane, nearly half of this net warming. And that's largely because when we emit other gases that warm the earth, we're also emitting pollutants that also counteract that warming with some cooling. So methane is a huge contributor to overall greenhouse gas warming. And it turns out that if you look at these charts, I'm going to do this very quickly, so I apologize, but the orange bar is how much we reduce temperatures under one scenario by doing a lot of CO2 or carbon dioxide decarbonization. By 2050, it's not showing much benefit. If you go this out to 2100, it's a huge benefit. It's very, very important. But in the near term, it's not as impactful as it turns out doing methane work on top of that. So one analogy, if you don't like the Vince Coleman analogy, another one is if you think about, the earth is slamming on the gas right now under business as usual. Decarbonization is like slamming on the brakes. But if you're worried about going over a cliff, you might also put your left foot down on the emergency brake at the same time, which is kind of what methane gives us alongside decarbonization. They're both going to help, and the emergency brake's going to help us quicker than the slamming on the brakes over the long run. So methane really matters. We launched this thing called the Global Methane Pledge a year ago in Glasgow. This is what I spend a lot of my time working on. It's now up to 150 countries. Importantly, it's now launching work in each of the 3 sectors that drive methane emissions. And I did want to just pause on this for a second. Here's where energy security and climate change really come to a head. If you think about Russia and Ukraine, for example, the amount of methane that is lost to the atmosphere through flaring intentionally or leakage and venting is on par with the amount of gas that Europe imports from Russia every year. So capturing that gas that shouldn't be going to the atmosphere anyway, it's a very valuable commodity, and sending it into pipelines, especially to Europe, is addressing a near-term energy security need and also a long-term climate security imperative. Just a quick note back on defense. I'm going to race through this quickly. I mentioned adaptation earlier. Here's Yadier Molina, who is the embodiment of incredible defense. The president launched last year something called the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, or PREPARE. This is a very, very big flagship initiative to address climate adaptation and resilience at a global scale. It's got a goal of helping 500 million people on the planet. So the planet just hit 8 billion. This is to try to help 500 million of those people build resilience to climate impacts and to mobilize $3 billion a year from the US government for climate finance. And then I think the last example I have, this is the Cardinals Farm system, just the importance of having an incredible system at all levels, which is something that's instrumental to baseball success, but it's also instrumental to climate success. No one level of governance, whether it's global or national or subnational, has a monopoly on what is needed to solve climate change. So there's this incredible movement called America is All In, which is an amalgamation of cities, counties, higher education, et cetera, working on climate. St. Louis City is a member of this coalition. St. Louis City has, as you all probably know, its own climate goals. And it turns out that Washington University is part of and has helped to foster a Midwest Climate Collaborative, which is several stakeholders from around the Midwest also advancing climate action. We do need action at all levels. It's sort of a we are all in kind of approach here. Okay, so that's what I wanted to run through, why it's a big issue, what we need to do about it, a few examples. And then my final closing thoughts before I take Q's and A's is this is really hard work and it's very daunting and at times incredibly depressing. But as a long-running Cardinals fan, I know that we do the unimaginable, right? So we've got examples that I haven't even covered, right? We have the Ozzie Smith's home run, which I heard running to the UCity netatorium on a transistor radio, and David Freese's home run in Game 6 as well. So we have certainly examples of doing the unexpected to pull victory from the jaws of defeat at the unlikeliest moments. And that's really what we need to do for climate change. So let me stop there and stop sharing and turn to Q's and A's. But I'll ask Gina maybe for any initial questions, or if you wanted to point me to any particular cues from the chat.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Daniel. I think you really did a great job of explaining kind of the reality and where we want to go, and making it not so gloom and doom, but showing that there are, set plans in place. I really thought the intersection of mitigation and adaptation was really interesting. And I know Cardinals fans on here appreciated that connection and help us think about it in a little bit different way. So excuse me, we'll start at the top, talking about the next generation of climate scientists, looking at using artificial intelligence in that space. Do you know of any universities or programs that they should be looking at to achieve this type of professional goal?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So this is the question from James, I see. Nothing jumps to mind, to be honest, but I think I would just encourage some very active Googling on this. What I did experience when I used to be at Emory University in Atlanta, and obviously grew up in the backyard of Washington University. I think most schools now, not most, a lot of schools, like several dozen, if not more, are taking climate change much more seriously than they ever did before. They are building curricula and certificates, and in some cases degree programs specifically around climate change. So what I would encourage your senior to do is to, first of all, they should feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk and put them in touch. And I think Gina can make that connection if it's helpful, but also just to look at schools that have made a commitment as a school to climate. And then here, if it's AI, you're probably looking to computer science programs in particular. And so I do know, certainly from my Georgia experience, several schools that were very strong in CS were also leaning into climate, and a little bit vice versa. So I hesitate to give you a specific example, but I think it's a really great question and worth looking into. I'll pause it there, but I'm happy to take that on later. One thing I'll say though is just when I was doing teaching at Emory, like one of the things I tried to impress on my students is this is unfortunately a massive growth industry, right? Like climate change is not going away anytime soon, and we need orders of magnitude more people on the team than we have right now. So just studying any aspect of climate is good because we need a lot of people on it.
Great. Thank you. You talked a lot about some of the policies and, the Paris Agreement, the conversations that are come out of COP27 most recently. So can you talk a little bit more about to what degree these developed nations have kept their climate control promises? And if they have, does that trend seem to continue, or is there more pressure needed from, and where is that pressure coming from to keep them on track?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's one of the most important questions, right? When we think about, when John Kerry, who I sort of didn't mention as strongly as I probably could have at the top, he's the President Biden's special presidential envoy for climate change. So his job is to basically be Secretary of State, which he used to do specifically for climate change. So he spends all of his time thinking about how do you broker international alliances to address this problem. And his mantra all of last year was this idea of implementation plus, which is, it is vitally important at this phase for every country that put a pledge forward to do everything they can to implement it. And then the plus, of course, is that we need to be thinking about upping our ambition too, because collectively, and in some countries' cases individually, the ambition does not yet rise to the scale of the challenge. It's early days to give you a concrete answer on follow through on the pledges, because it is still relatively early in this decisive decade. But there are a lot of groups that are looking specifically at this question and a lot of processes that are meant to address this. So In a formal matter, you'll see this year and the years to come, formal submissions by countries on how they're doing. And externally, you'll see, I think the report I would direct you to is something called the Emissions Gap Report by the UN Environment Program, which really took a step back of like, all the pledges we have now, is that enough? And then starting to unpack thoughts on progress to date on the pledges. It's definitely worth thinking at. And I think one of our frustrations coming out of COP27, despite some real progress, was though several countries increased their ambition since Glasgow, some of the biggest countries really have yet to do so. And that's something that we really, really want to see.
Great. And then to kind of build off of that, if we're looking to reduce greenhouse gases by 50% by the year 2030, what are some of the milestones that we need to hit between now and then to achieve this goal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent question. So I mentioned, maybe after the question came in, the IRA and this climate bill, this bill that has a big climate provision in it. That, as you saw in that modeling, puts us close to on track, if and only if those provisions are executed to their fullest. And I think that's a place to watch, right? Is milestones to achieve that is between that and the bipartisan infrastructure law and the CHIPS Act and any number of other policies, incentives, regulations. Are they being implemented? Are they being implemented effectively? And are they making progress? And then I also mentioned the need for efforts at the subnational level. So looking at commitments by governors, by mayors, and then very much thinking about the role of the non-governmental space as well. So private sector commitments. One thing I didn't mention earlier, which is very exciting coming out of the past couple of years, is something called the First Movers Coalition, which is 65 companies, some of the biggest companies on the planet, making, I think it's now $12 billion worth of commitments to basically buy zero carbon, I think it's all zero carbon actually, not low carbon, technologies to drive a demand signal for those technologies to increase their acceleration. So that's another thing to look at, is what's happening in the private sector in terms of investment, both on the R&D side as well as the deployment side.
Great, thanks. The next question I'm going to combine two and look more at agriculture and the global food systems. St. Louis, as you probably know, has a plethora of agriculture being based in the Midwest. That's the industry that I work in as well. So first, what percentage of greenhouse gases does the global food system contribute to? And then two, are there policy supports for innovation in agriculture as we think of adaptation and mitigation? How do we support agriculture to get where it needs to go to continue to feed people, but also in response to the climate challenges?
Yeah, like incredibly important question, set of questions really, and topic. First, on the percentage of global emissions, I should have a number top of mind, but I don't, and I apologize, but it is a Google away, and I would encourage Googling it. Second, Gina, in the way you framed it, you're right to flag that agriculture plays an absolutely essential role on both sides of the coin, sort of the offense and defense I showed you, right? Like there are a lot of emissions related to the food system that can be abated. And then there's a lot of where climate hits home most is impacts on food security and agricultural productivity. I spent about 10 years in Georgia, and while I was missing St. Louis, I was really loving the experience of learning from farmers there about how climate really is damaging. And we saw hurricanes come through and devastate. The cotton crop was about to be harvested when Hurricane Michael came through, as one example. So in terms of specifics and innovation, first of all, there's a thing you should look up called the AIM4C, Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate. It was actually a flagship initiative launched by the US government with UAE and several others in Glasgow in 2021. It was further capitalized last year, and we expect it to be a continued push going forward, specifically to mobilize investment in innovation and research and development in the ag climate nexus space. So it's actually a direct hit on the question that you're asking about. The other things to flag, first of all, in the Inflation Reduction Act and in sort of domestic policy and the great work that USDA is doing is a lot of work, as many of you probably know, at the nexus of ag and climate, which is beyond my expertise, but something I'm very supportive of and excited about and would like to learn more about, to be honest. And then a third thing to flag is the nexus of ag and methane. So I mentioned methane, and the three big drivers of methane emissions, human-caused methane emissions, are oil and gas, waste, well, also coal. So energy, waste, and agriculture. And the solutions there are really important, of course, for the planet. We cannot keep 1.5 within reach without achieving the global methane pledge. We can't achieve the global methane pledge without a lot of action across developed and developing countries. One thing that we've really gravitated towards in recent months in terms of new initiatives is the incredible nexus between livestock productivity in developing countries and reduced methane emissions intensity. So it turns out there's this incredible win-win-win if you are the World Bank, or you are a farmer in Kenya, or you are an agriculture minister in Kenya, between a development imperative economically, a food security imperative, and a climate imperative by boosting the productivity of livestock, in this case, like dairy. So there's some major new initiatives on dairy productivity as one example. There's also a lot of interesting work around rice production as well. And on the US side, I know there's a lot of renewed focus on R&D to think about things like feed additives and other solutions that might reduce emissions from both manure management and enteric fermentation.
Great, thank you. And then I'm going to shift a little bit to policy. So we know that the talk about climate and climate resiliency and those challenges has shifted throughout the years, and we see some politicians who are still fighting against the policies that we're trying to enact to mitigate and adapt to these climate challenges. Do you see a shift in mindset within policymakers? And then how are we as a government, a country, working to fund these, especially given the current, climate now, no pun intended, climate of inflation and that sort of thing? How do we find that balance of making sure that we have policymakers on board, have a way to pay for it, and then have a way to justify that?
Yeah, it's an incredibly good question. It's one that I will, I think, respond, well, my response will be informed by where I'm sitting right now, right? Just representing the US government and the executive branch. So I've got like less of a stake right now than maybe I used to in my previous life in terms of the back and forth. I will say though, at a personal level and drawing on my previous life, you see behind me a poster for a conference we had in Georgia. The frame of that conference was minimizing the risks to Georgia and maximizing the opportunities. The idea that like, no matter what political stripe, political persuasion, there are real risks to bottom lines that are happening now that are going to get worse. And moreover, if you get out ahead of those risks, there's huge opportunity, both in avoiding those costs, but also there's money to be made in clean technologies, right? Things like that. And that, I think, case is location agnostic and hopefully party agnostic, right? But it is true that this has become a very partisan issue over the years. And in terms of where US policy is or policies are going, in terms of investments, to your question, I think I will just observe the Inflation Reduction Act was unprecedented climate legislation. So this is legislative, signed by the executive at a scale that was never been achieved before. So that is a change in how the US society and the US government has approached climate change. And it comes with it, what's nice about it, I think, is it's very much carrot more than stick. There are $369 billion invested through the Inflation Reduction Act in putting money in people's hands to do things that are good for the climate, whether it's residential energy efficiency or an offshore wind developer or a farmer that's going to reduce climate impacts. It's a pretty positive approach. So
great. And then we'll do one last question, and I'll give you the opportunity to any last closing statements. But we've talked a lot about on the government level, policy level. What about on the individual level? We hear a lot of conflicting statements about recycling and people not recycling properly and end up in the dump instead. So as an individual, are there small steps that we can take that maybe over time, they may be small, but add up to, something that we can contribute to and ultimately play a small role in this?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. My response or my thoughts on it are, it's a little bit maybe nuanced, I suppose. One is the people who ask the question, what can I do, are probably a small minority of the people on the planet who are asking that question. If everyone simply took care of their carbon footprint and that was all they did, it wouldn't add up to what we need. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do everything we can. So everyone doing their bit, there's incredible spillover benefits, there's crowd motivation, et cetera. So please do everything you can, number one. And there are some things that really are kind of interesting and emergent because things like waste policy is now becoming more of a focus, composting and organic. These are things that are actually they're household level decisions that impact the planet. I would also, though, encourage folks who are asking that question to just go to their resources around them. So I mentioned this We Are All In community of hundreds of community stakeholder groups, from governors to mayors to NGOs to businesses who are taking action. Like, spend 30 minutes talking to somebody doing that, because the chances are, we each emit about 20 tons a year and the planet emits 50 billion tons a year. Chances are, if you talk to someone at the level of a city or a governor or a state or whatever, they're operating at a scale that could get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tons out of the sky. And if you're going to pick, 8 hours of your year to work on this issue, I think you do have a choice to make about whether those 8 hours go into cleaning up your own act, which is great, and maybe that's the easiest thing to do, or whether you want to spend those 8 hours, like there might be some really wonky arcane policy that if you just showed up at a particular town meeting, you could actually shape a community, solar policy or whatever it is. And I want to be policy agnostic, but just to encourage thinking about the ability to achieve change at a greater scale than the individual.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think sometimes we always need that reminder that advocacy goes a long way when it comes to policies and interacting with local and national officials. So thank you so much. Well, we're at time. Daniel, thank you so much for your time today. I thought your presentation was fascinating and very easy to understand. So thank you, because I know it can be very easy to talk at a very high level on this type of topic. So we thank you again. Just as a couple of wrap-up reminders from the World Affairs Council, our Great Decisions will return virtually in 2023. We'll be beginning in February. We're also seeking dinner hosts for international visitors. So this gives you an opportunity to interact with some of our visitors from all around the world, host them at your house, have good conversation and good food. And then if you're interested in becoming a member, Seth is going to put a link in the chat box, and you can also subscribe to the World Affairs Council newsletter from that link. So thank you all for joining us. And once again, thank you again, Daniel, for your time today. And look forward to hopefully future conversations and follow-up.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me, and enjoy the next sessions that you have.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.